It is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Andy Grotto. Andy is the director of the program on geopolitics, technology, and governance at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center. He's also a William J. Perry International Security Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute and visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. Andy was formerly senior director for cyber policy on the National Security Council in both the Obama and the Trump administrations, and before that served as a professional staff member for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Andy also leads the cyber specialization curriculum for the Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy program at FSI, where he teaches the core fundamentals course on cyber policy. His research is in the vortex of cybersecurity, national security, and the economics of tech and innovation, and he has had involvement in virtually every major policy debate over the last 10 years, spanning his experience with Congress, the executive branch, and in academia. So I'm so happy to turn it over to him and jump in to preview this executive education that we are going to run in August, and we hope you can join us.
Great, thanks Danielle. Welcome to everyone. It's a pleasure to join you all this morning or afternoon, as the case may be for some of you from further flung places than the Bay Area. I hope you and your families are safe and sound in these unusual and trying times. So I have two goals for our webinar today. One is to give sort of a short course overview for the executive education program that we're planning to run in August. And then I want to give you kind of an amuse-bouche, an appetizer on what some of the course content will look like. And in this case, I want to focus in particular on this question of attribution, which ends up consuming a lot of media attention, a lot of policy focus. And I want to provide a sort of an analytic framework for business leaders and leaders in public organizations for how to think about attribution decisions. Before I get into the course overview, I know that there's a lot of questions still around what will and won't be open as far as shelter in place goes. Our assumption is that this course will run in August. We still have spots available, so if you're interested, our plan so far is all systems go. So with that, let me jump into the course overview. So there's this old saying among cyber nerds like me that there's sort of two types of organizations that have know that they've been hacked, and organizations that have been hacked. In other words, data breaches, cybersecurity incidents are almost inevitable in this day and age. And what you see in front of you is the results of a survey that the UK government did of businesses. This is in the UK specifically, but I think the results are pretty applicable worldwide. That in their survey, basically 1/3 of businesses experienced a breach or an attack in the last 12 months. And then you can see what impact it had on their business operations. With preventing staff from carrying out their work functions, consuming resources that could be spent on pursuing mission objectives, building a business, and so on. Headlines, I mean, if you read the newspaper, even this morning, there's a headline in the New York Times about a new cyber attack attributed by an Israeli research group to the Chinese military. The pandemic has become a source of exploitation for malicious actors who are using the pandemic both to spearfish, right, trick people into opening up emails with malicious attachments related to COVID-19, preying on their fears to try to hack their systems. There's also a lot of ransomware attacks against businesses and other organizations. Last Friday, President Trump declared a national emergency as based on evidence that foreign hackers were seeking to infiltrate the U.S. power grid. And then, of course, the FBI has seen a major spike in cybercrime reports during this pandemic. This is just, the last, month or so. You'll see that, among boards cybersecurity is top of mind. The World Economic Forum does this survey of business leaders every year, and this is the most recent report. You'll see that cyber attacks are essentially and data theft and fraud are among the highest impact and highest probability risks that are top of mind for them. At the same time, this is a report from another survey that Marsh and Microsoft did, where you see that across time, cyber risks outrank all other risks by a wide margin. And the question posed to the respondents was, the following business threats, please rank the top 5 that are the biggest concerns to your organization. And you'll see that 80% listed cyber attacks in the top 5, with almost a quarter of them identifying cyber risk as the #1 risk. Now, what's worrisome about this is that even as the awareness of the threat is growing, the scale and scope of the threat is expanding, leaders' confidence in their ability to manage this set of risks is actually declining. So you'll see here that essentially there's not a ton of confidence among business leaders that they or their organizations are in a position to understand, assess, measure cyber threats, to mitigate or prevent cyber threats, or manage and respond to cyber threats. So that to me is really worrying. It shows a real gap between the growing magnitude of the threat and and the confidence in our business leaders and our policymakers in their ability to manage this growing and complex risk. Meanwhile, we're only becoming more and more reliant on the digital world for our daily lives. This is a story that's probably familiar to most, but as we move to a world of ubiquitous connectivity, sensing, processing, the attack surface, the number of devices on the internet will grow. Our reliance on computers and networks will grow. And just to put that into perspective, this is some statistics from IDC that shows that by 2025, just the sheer volume of Internet of Things connections will increase by a factor of about 4 or 5, just in the next five or so years. Now, meanwhile, policymakers have been focused on cyber threats, particularly in the U.S. I was involved in a lot of these debates, as Danielle said, during my time in government, and the pace is only quickening. And so I just put up here, a smattering of recent headlines on different regulatory and legislative initiatives around the world that are aimed at trying to address cyber risks. And these policy interventions are primarily aimed at the private sector and have the potential for major impact on business operations. And so, the actors involved range from California, a U.S. state, to the European Union, China, the U.S. federal government. So let me now turn directly to the course with that background. The overarching goal of the program will be to close that confidence deficit that I identified by delivering foundational knowledge on cyber risk, cyber policy, and resilience to our students. So we'll cover the tech basics, and we'll adjust how deep we go depending on what the complexion of the student cadre looks like. But we don't assume any technical expertise on the part of students. And if we happen to get students with deep technical expertise, we'll have some room to make adjustments to the curriculum based on what the complexion of the class looks like. We'll cover the fundamentals of cyber risk management. We'll cover threat actors, their motivations. We'll cover regulatory policy, incident response, and statecraft and the international aspects of cyber policy and cyber risk. How we'll cover it? There'll be lectures. We're assembling, I think, a pretty crack team of instructors with experience, both practical experience as well as experience talking about cyber issues in a clear and intelligible way. We'll lean on group work to get the students interacting with each other, learning from each other, and we'll do scenario exercises. And so, bring your tracksuit and your Walkman. I love doing exercises. I find that simulations are a really powerful way to help bring content home. I want to make one point about the content that so there's this difference between education and training, right? So training is about learning to do a particular task. Education is about building a foundation. This is about education. So our goal is not to provide sort of a regimented step-by-step approach to if you suffer a cyber incident, or if the US Congress is pursuing a legislative initiative on X, here's what you do. That's not what we want to do. We want to provide the foundation so that students can cover and manage teams across all these different cyber and problems that come up in business and in public policy. And so to that end, our students that we have in mind are executives in leadership roles or seeking such roles where literacy and cyber risk and policy are essential to mission success. So with that, let's jump into the amuse-bouche, the appetizer. Attribution, whodunit. This is probably a little bit of a generational thing. I used to love watching Murder, She Wrote. It was an American TV show with Angela Lansbury. Actually, it may have been English. Apologies to any UK residents on the call. But it involved, she was a writer who solved murder mysteries, real life murder mysteries, and it speaks to this instinct that when a crime happens, our sort of collective consciousness, media narrative, policymakers, business leaders, boards, all want to know, okay, who did it? Like, there was this bad act, who did it? It's a natural question. And it can matter a whole lot for things like, holding malicious actors accountable, for deterrence, imposing costs on perpetrators. But the media and policy and public discourse on attribution tends to frame this issue a little too simplistically for my tastes, as an act of public attribution. In other words, there's this binary choice, supposedly, in a lot of the narrative about cyber risk management, that organizations have a choice between public attribution and no attribution. And I think that's wrong, and I want to leave you with some thoughts on that. My goal is to dispel that notion, provide leaders in business and government with a vocabulary and framework for thinking about how to communicate about cyber incidents that affect them or their stakeholders. So I want to introduce a couple concepts. Two overarching concepts, analytic attribution and strategic attribution. Analytic attribution you can think of as who do we think did it? It's based on what an analyst knows or thinks he or she knows about the identity of a malicious cyber actor. It's often based on forensic and other technical artifacts, but not necessarily limited to that type of technical detail. At the end of the day, it's a falsifiable claim about who perpetrated an attack. Strategic attribution is, okay, so you've got this theory of who done it. What now do you do with that? And there are at least four options that I want to leave you with. One is what I call private attribution. You could keep that analytic judgment private. Selective attribution, you could disclose that judgment to selected third parties. Public attribution, you could make your judgment about attribution public. And then, of course, maybe this is my favorite one, the false flag attribution, where you purposefully misattribute in some strategic way. So you have a theory of who done it, but you pin the blame on someone else for some purpose. The key takeaway from this vocabulary and this way of sort of breaking down this concept of attribution is that decisions about strategic attribution are or should be guided by political and economic factors pertaining to which mode of strategic attribution most advances the decision maker's interest. And so, in other words, a decision about what to do with an analytic attribution is not a technical decision. It is a management and leadership decision. And I'll illustrate this point with a few kind of made up examples that have some, you may recognize, some of the characters in these vignettes I'm going to share with you. But the names have been changed to protect the innocent. Plus, it just makes it easier for me to talk about it. So, first here we have a company, Acme Widget Company, publicly traded company, suffered cyber-enabled theft of its trade secrets. The executive team assesses that malicious cyber actors located in the territory of Acharya, acting on behalf of a state-owned company there, were behind this incident. The assessment is based in part on forensic data, but also the timing of the event coincided with negotiations with NCC over a joint venture in Acharya. So in this case, Acme has analytically attributed the attack to NCC. It's arrived at an analytic judgment about who done it. Another sort of spin on this, another take on this. Okay, so now we have a country, a public organization. Mauritius is a rule of law-oriented Western democracy in the Anglo-American tradition. Sounds familiar. Acharya also sounds a little familiar. Is a fledgling democracy allied with Mauritius. It has this unresolved border dispute with Rosaria, a longtime adversary of Mauritius. The lead intelligence service in Mauritius disseminates a classified intelligence assessment internally to Mauritius policymakers that the actors behind this attack are likely affiliated with a Rosarian intelligence unit. This assessment is based on foreign intelligence collection and forensic data brought back to Mauritius by a fly-in team of Mauritius government experts invited by Acharya to support its forensic analysis of the attack. This is another case of analytic attribution. The Mauritius government has come to an analytic judgment about who done it. So let's talk about these in a little more detail. So in these examples, each protagonist has formulated a judgment about analytic attribution, and for now at least they've kept that private. They've drawn on different data sources to arrive at their analytic attributions. So Acme's executive team, for example, based its analytic judgment on information from the company systems, but also their business instincts. While the Mauritius intelligence service drew upon intelligence sources and methods, along with this trust relationship it has with Acharya that permitted its experts to gain some firsthand insights into the attack. In these examples, the protagonist's confidence level in their analytic judgment can be expressed in different ways. And so, in the case of Mauritius, assuming that this is a professional intelligence service, right? There would be really expressed clear language about its confidence level, high, medium, low, in its attribution assessment. And this assessment, this confidence level, is a function of how specific and direct the intelligence is, right? And so, to the extent, of course, that the intelligence is valuable and potentially fragile. For example, involved SIGINT or some other sensitive intelligence aperture, the originators of that intelligence will have strong incentives to prevent, to compartmentalize and limit the distribution of that intelligence to only those who need to know. Now, what's important to note is that analytic attribution, this internal judgment about who done it, can provoke or inform action. This often gets lost, I think, in a lot of the public debate about cyber risk management and cyber policy. Coming to a private judgment about analytic attribution is not necessarily consequence-free. An actor's willingness to take potentially costly actions based on an analytic attribution speaks volumes about its confidence level in the accuracy of the attribution. And in both of these cases, this analytic attribution could have a real impact on their internal decisions. So in the case of Acme, it could decide, maybe we're not going to do business anymore in Acharya, or at a minimum, maybe we're going to break off our negotiations with NCC. In the case of Mauritius, this could lead it to reprioritize its intelligence collection and have other impacts on its relationship with both Acharya and Rosaria. Now, by the same token, it's important, I think, to note that some defensive actions don't even require analytic attribution, right? So a defender does not, in some cases, necessarily need to know the identity of an adversary to implement known technical defenses. And just despite the interest in whodunit, in many cases, defenders don't need to know that in order to do their job. But that said, of course, there are times when it does help defenders to know who did it, because it could help set learning the identity of the attacker and their motivations can help the defender set mitigation priorities and more effectively assess risk. So let's turn now to a couple examples of strategic attribution. So here we have Acme again, and it's CISO decides to share information about the incident along with the company's analytic attribution to a trusted circle of fellow CISOs at similarly situated companies to help them and also to reinforce reciprocity norms among this community of CISOs about sharing threat information within this circle of trust. They share the information under this information sharing rubric called the traffic light protocol. I'll say a little bit more about that to highlight the sensitivity of the information, right? Traffic light protocol red is a way to say this is sensitive information. Don't disclose without getting further permission from the originator. And then the company general counsel also shares information about the incident with outside counsel to understand the legal risks and notifies Amarish's law enforcement of the incident. So in this case, Acme has selectively attributed the attack to NCC. And by selective, it is not engaged in a public attribution. It is selectively shared its analytical attribution with certain third parties. Let's come back to Amarish's. In this case, Amarish's provides classified threat briefings to major Amarish's grid operators about this attack. And in the classified briefing, the Amarish's government describes its classified analytic attribution of Rosaria as the perpetrator as context to reinforce the severity of the need for the operators to prioritize these particular mitigations. The briefers also hope that the quality of the briefing, including the decision to share sensitive forensic attribution details, will persuade the operators to reciprocate and engage in information sharing with Amarish's about the threat and what they see on their networks. And so in this case, the Amarish's government has selectively attributed the attack to Rosaria, with major grid operators as the recipients of the selective attribution. So let's talk about these two cases a little more. In this case, the Amarish's briefers shared their analytic attribution with a subset of critical infrastructure owners and operators to protect public safety. They made a judgment that in this case, the Amarish's interests were best served by engaging in selective attribution, short of public attribution, blasting a press release saying we think that this or that country did it. Now, what we've got to think about is by being so selective in its outreach to the private sector, Amarish's has now assumed new risks. So what if Rosaria or another malicious actor was able to use substantially similar tradecraft to attack sectors that hadn't been briefed? Of course, most importantly, this would put the people of Amarish's at risk of harm, but it could also jeopardize the political fortunes of Amarish's leadership, who in the aftermath of such an attack would face the inevitable second guessing of why they had failed to brief more companies. So what does, and there's a question of, okay, what does Acharya think about Amarish's actions? And should Amarish's care? After all, Acharya is not likely to let a foreign government, even a friendly one, examine infrastructure that was targeted by a hostile foreign power without some guarantee that the fruits of that examination would make their way back to Acharya. And so one of the issues that Malicious and Acharya and their respective legal advisors would want to have worked through in advance is calibrating both sides' expectations about what is and is not shared by way of intelligence associated with the incident. Based, since Malicious had this fly-in team come in, there's now this, the attribution is tied in some way to this relationship with Acharya. Malicious could share its technical findings with Acharya, but leave it up to Acharya to connect the attribution, the analytic attribution dots, or it could go a step further and engage Acharya in a more robust analytic exchange and dialogue that could include judgments about analytic attribution. Either way, the two parties are going to want to think about this in advance. Coming to talking a little bit more about Acme. So the executives are trying to get their heads around what happened by seeking external advice and assistance, with the CISO recognizing that peer InfoSec officers in similar companies might be facing similar risks. They come back to TLP. So TLP is widely used by InfoSec practitioners to label threat information relating to its perceived sensitivity. And it essentially is a request to handle the information with that sensitivity in mind. And TLP Red is the highest classification under this scheme. It means that material is not for disclosure and restricted only to the immediate recipients of that information. That kind of exchange happens all the time in the corporate InfoSec world. And at least the anecdotal evidence I've seen suggests that these exchanges result in stronger defenses. On the other hand, these exchanges often occur without the knowledge or consent of the company's senior executives. These exchanges tend to be informal and rooted in personal bonds of trust and done with some level of secrecy. And so in this case, the fact that the information is labeled TLP Red means that the information that the Acme CISO shared shouldn't be shared even beyond the immediate recipient. So that would include other parts of the organizations who the recipients belong to, including their senior executives. Now it's important to note that the TLP scheme is not binding on participants. Putting a TLP classification on a document or asserting it in a conversation does not create any legal rights or duties among the parties to the exchange. And so unless the recipients sign non-disclosure agreements or some other agreement or a specific law is broken, Acme would have no recourse under the law to sue or press charges against a recipient who violates the terms of TLP Red sharing. As the example indicates, Acme is in the widget business. And assuming it's a conscientious, well-managed business, the company's management team will work closely with its CISO and legal counsel to get an accurate handle on what information within the company was exposed in the breach and what courses it must then pursue by way of mitigation and resilience. Was it just information relating to the negotiations with NCC, or was other information exposed, such as trade secrets or customer data? To the extent that customer data was exposed, is the company needing to notify its customers under the law or for business reputation reasons? And if so, does it disclose its analytic attribution? In other words, engage in selective attribution. As a publicly traded company, are there any market disclosures it needs to make under malicious securities law? Is the company's analytic attribution of the incident to NCC materially relevant to the market implications of the breach? It could be, to the extent that the breach affects the company's plans in Acharya. So last but not least, and I'm going to wrap up here in just a few minutes, and we'll turn to Q&A, is taking these examples one step further. So here now, okay, so Acme Widget Companies now decide to file a lawsuit in the malicious court against NCC for theft of trade secrets. and other damages in its pleadings. Now, Acme has publicly attributed the attack to NCC. It went through this process of, okay, they reached an analytic judgment about analytic attribution, whodunit. They decided initially to engage in selective attribution, sharing it with a select group of third parties. Now they decided that their interests are best served by filing a lawsuit against NCC for theft of trade secrets and other damages. They have now publicly attributed the attack to NCC. Turning to malicious, the ministers of energy, homeland security, and state issue a joint statement implicating or accusing Rosaria for the attack. And the ministers and their law enforcement colleagues publish an alert on the technical aspects of the public alert with recommended mitigation steps. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Justice indicts 3 operators in the Rosaria Military Intelligence Service for criminal prosecution, and the Ministries of Commerce and Treasury impose sanctions, and so on. Now, of course, here the Mauritius government has publicly attributed the attack to Rosaria through several channels. The key, I think, point about this last, these sort of last vignettes is that, okay, so we're public attribution now. We began with an internal assessment of whodunit. There's a lot of action that happened between analytic attribution and these acts of public attribution. Business leaders at Acme Widget Company, the Mauritius government had a range of options between analytics attribution and public attribution. They could engage, they could decide to keep their analytic judgment private. They could decide to engage, which they might do. They could decide to engage in selective attribution, a decision to close it to selected third parties. They could engage in public attribution. We didn't talk too much about false flag attribution beyond just listing it here for completeness, but they could decide to accuse someone else. The key point here is that decisions, and just to wrap, kind of come full circle, ultimately decisions about strategic attribution should be guided by political and economic factors pertaining to which mode of strategic attribution most advances the decision maker's interests. It is not simply or strictly a technical judgment about who done it. And in fact, judgment about who done it may include intelligence and business instincts that go beyond technical artifacts. At the end of the day, strategic attribution is fundamentally a decision for executives to make, and shouldn't be left should be treated as such by senior management, whether it's a private organization or in government. I can tell you that that was certainly how we handled issues of this question when I was at the NSC, and there were many cases where we, the U.S. government, had an analytic attribution about who done it, but the question of what to do with it was always a policy decision, and guided by political and economic factors. So I will stop there.
I would like to thank you, Andy, so much for your webinar. I think it was really interesting. I don't know if Danielle has anything else you would like to add in the end. Nope. Okay, so I think we are all good. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I hope you will spend restful, what's today? Thursday, and have a nice weekend.
Thank you,
everybody.
Bye now. Take care, everyone. Be safe.